All names, places, and institutions are aliases used to protect privacy. Procedures and timelines reflect real-world law and forensics for immersion. The fluorescent lights in the Granite County Courthouse hummed with the indifferent buzz of a system that had seen thousands of men pass through its corridors. But on this October morning, only one man mattered. Defendant Rook sat at a table in a cramped hearing room, his wrists no longer shackled for the first time in 17 years. The chains had been removed at his attorney's request, a small dignity before the judge ruled on the motion that would determine whether Rook would walk out of this building a free man or return to the transport van waiting in the basement. His attorney, post-conviction counsel North, shuffled through a manila folder containing lab reports that had taken 3 years of legal battles to obtain. The envelope at the center of the folder bore a faded evidence tag dated 19 years prior. A tag that should have been examined decades ago, but instead had gathered dust in the property room of the Riverbend Police Department. Across the aisle, State's Attorney Slate reviewed his own notes, his expression unreadable. He had not prosecuted the original case. That distinction belonged to a man now retired, living somewhere on the coast, collecting a pension funded by convictions just like this one. But Slate had inherited the file, and with it, the responsibility to either defend the verdict or acknowledge what the new evidence suggested. The gallery behind them held perhaps 20 people. Victim advocate Lyndon sat with the family of the murdered woman, their faces carved with the exhaustion of people who had believed justice was served nearly 2 decades ago, and now faced the possibility that the real killer had never been caught. In the back row, a gray-haired woman clutched a photograph against her chest. Rook's mother, Iris, who had attended every hearing, every appeal, every denied motion for 17 years. Judge Keystone entered through the side door, and the bailiff called the room to order. What happened in the next 3 hours would either validate 17 years of protest or confirm that the system, for all its flaws, had reached the correct result. But before we examine the evidence that brought everyone to this room, we need to understand the crime that started it all, and the investigation that produced one of the most controversial convictions Granite County had ever seen. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing to join us on these journeys through the cases that challenge everything we think we know about guilt and innocence. 19 years earlier, the city of Riverbend was a modest industrial hub of approximately 80,000 residents, nestled along a river that had once powered textile mills and now served primarily as a backdrop for the downtown revitalization efforts that never quite materialized. The east side of the city contained the older neighborhoods, working-class blocks of duplexes and small single-family homes where residents knew each other by first name and kept an eye on each other's children. It was in one of these neighborhoods, on the evening of March 14th, that 29-year-old Elena Vance was murdered in her ground-floor apartment on Meadow Street. Elena worked as a receptionist at a local medical clinic and was known in her neighborhood as a friendly, quiet woman who kept to herself but always waved to the elderly residents on her block. She had moved to Riverbend 3 years prior following a divorce and had no local family. The 911 call came at 7:42 p.m. from a neighbor, Gerald Tate, who reported hearing screaming and the sound of breaking glass. When patrol officers arrived 11 minutes later, they found Elena's front door ajar. Inside, the living room showed signs of a violent struggle. An overturned coffee table, shattered lamp, blood spatter on the wall near the kitchen doorway. Elena's body was discovered in the bedroom, partially clothed, with ligature marks around her neck. The medical examiner would later determine she had been strangled with a length of electrical cord that was recovered at the scene. Lead Detective Harbor arrived at 8:35 p.m. and immediately recognized the gravity of the case. Riverbend averaged perhaps 2 or 3 homicides per year, and a violent sexual assault and murder of a young woman would generate significant public pressure for a quick resolution. The crime scene yielded several pieces of physical evidence. Fingerprints were lifted from multiple surfaces, though many would later be attributed to Elena herself, or to friends and maintenance workers with legitimate reasons to have been in the apartment. A partial palm print was recovered from the bedroom doorframe. Most significantly, sexual assault evidence was collected during the autopsy, biological material that would later become the centerpiece of the entire case. Initial canvassing produced the name that would alter one man's life forever. Gerald Tate, the neighbor who called 911, mentioned that he had seen a man matching a general description: tall, wearing a dark jacket, walking away from Elena's building approximately 20 minutes before he heard the screaming. Another neighbor, Dorothy Kramer, said she had seen a similar figure near the parking lot. Within 3 days, Detective Harbour had a suspect. Marcus Cole, the man who would come to be known by the alias Rook, was a 31-year-old auto mechanic who lived 4 blocks from Elena's apartment. He had a prior conviction for aggravated assault from 8 years earlier, a bar fight that had resulted in another man's hospitalization. He was tall. He owned a dark jacket. And most damningly, according to the initial investigation, he had no verifiable alibi for the window of time when Elena was killed. Rook was brought in for questioning on March 17th, 3 days after the murder. The interrogation lasted approximately 11 hours, conducted in shifts by Detective Harbour and his partner, Detective Marsh. The session was not recorded, a practice that was common at the time but would later become a point of significant controversy. According to the detective's written reports, Rook initially denied knowing Elena Vance, then admitted he had seen her around the neighborhood, then became increasingly agitated as the questioning continued. At approximately the 9th hour of interrogation, according to the police report, Rook made statements that the prosecution would characterize as admissions of guilt. He allegedly told detectives that he had done something terrible and that he couldn't take back what happened. He was formally arrested and charged with first-degree murder and sexual assault. The case against Rook was built on 4 primary pillars. First, the eyewitness identification. Gerald Tate was shown a photo array containing Rook's picture and identified him as the man he had seen near Elena's building. Dorothy Kramer made a similar identification from a live lineup conducted 2 weeks after the murder. Second, the alleged confession. The statements Rook made during the 11-hour interrogation, as documented in Detective Harbour's report. Third, the physical evidence. A forensic analyst from Arcadia Lab, Juniper, testified that hairs recovered from Elena's bedroom were consistent with samples taken from Rook, a conclusion based on microscopic hair comparison, a technique that was widely used at the time but has since been largely discredited by the scientific community. Fourth, a jailhouse informant named Vincent Crowell testified that Rook had confessed to the murder while the two were housed in the same cell block awaiting trial. Public Defender Stone, assigned to represent Rook because he could not afford private counsel, faced an uphill battle. Stone had a caseload of approximately 140 cases at the time and was able to devote limited resources to investigating the prosecution's claims. He filed motions challenging the admissibility of the alleged confession, arguing that Rook had been coerced through exhaustion and psychological manipulation during the lengthy interrogation. Judge Harmon, who presided over the trial, denied the motion, finding that Rook had been properly advised of his rights and had not unambiguously requested an attorney. The trial lasted 6 days. Prosecutor Blake, the man who would retire a decade later, presented a straightforward narrative. Rook, a man with a history of violence, had become obsessed with Elena Vance, attacked her in her apartment, sexually assaulted her, and strangled her to death. The eyewitnesses placed him at the scene. The hair evidence linked him to the victim's bedroom. His own words, spoken to detectives and later to a fellow inmate, confirmed his guilt. Stone's defense was hampered by limited resources and the weight of the evidence. He attacked the reliability of the eyewitness identifications, noting that both Gerald Tate and Dorothy Kramer had only seen the man from a distance in poor lighting for a matter of seconds. He questioned the circumstances of the interrogation, arguing that any statements Rook made came after hours of pressure and should not be considered reliable. He challenged Vincent Crowell's credibility, noting that Crowell had received a reduced sentence on his own charges in exchange for his testimony, a fact the prosecution was required to disclose and did, though Stone argued the disclosure was insufficient. But Stone did not have access to DNA testing of the biological evidence collected from Elena's body. In the mid-1990s, DNA analysis was available but expensive, and the prosecution argued that the hair comparison evidence was sufficient. Stone did not have the resources to commission independent testing, and his request for state-funded DNA analysis was denied by Judge Harmon on grounds that other evidence was adequate to establish identity. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. When they returned, the foreman read the verdict: guilty on both counts. Rook was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was 31 years old. The first 5 years were the hardest. Rook was transferred to the Fernwood Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison approximately 300 miles from Riverbend. His mother, Iris, visited when she could, once a month when her health and finances permitted, less frequently as both deteriorated over time. His younger brother stopped visiting after the 3rd year, unable to reconcile the man he knew with the crime described in the newspapers. Prison is not designed for innocence. It operates on the assumption that everyone within its walls belongs there, and it punishes those who refuse to accept their guilt. Rook was denied parole consideration at his first hearing, held 15 years after his conviction, in part because he refused to express remorse for a crime he insisted he did not commit. The parole board interpreted his protestations of innocence as evidence of a failure to accept responsibility, a psychological deficit that suggested he remained a danger to society. During his time at Fernwood, Rook filed 3 pro se appeals, legal motions drafted without attorney assistance, all of which were denied. He wrote letters to journalists, to innocence organizations, to anyone who might listen. Most went unanswered. The few responses he received offered sympathy, but little hope. Meanwhile, in Riverbend, Elena Vance's family tried to move forward. Her parents had died believing justice had been served. Her sister, Margot, attended every parole hearing to argue against Rook's release. She had spent nearly 2 decades believing that the man who killed her sister was behind bars. The possibility that she might be wrong was not something she permitted herself to consider. But in the Granite County evidence room, a cardboard box sat on a metal shelf, gathering dust. Inside that box was an envelope containing biological material collected from Elena Vance's body during her autopsy, material that had been tested using the limited serological methods available at the time of trial, but had never been subjected to modern DNA analysis. The break came from an unexpected source. In the 16th year of Rook's incarceration, a non-profit organization called the Halcyon Innocence Project took an interest in his case. Attorney North, a former public defender who had transitioned to post-conviction work, reviewed the trial transcript and was struck by several concerning elements. The alleged confession troubled her most. Rook had reportedly made incriminating statements after approximately 9 hours of interrogation, but the statements themselves were ambiguous. "I did something terrible" could mean many things. Without a recording of the interrogation, there was no way to assess the context in which the statements were made, the questions that preceded them, or Rook's mental state at the time. The jailhouse informant was equally problematic. Vincent Crowell had testified in multiple cases over the years, always in exchange for leniency on his own charges. His credibility had been questioned by defense attorneys in at least 3 other trials, though juries had consistently chosen to believe him. And the hair evidence, consistent with testimony from forensic analyst Juniper, was based on a methodology that had since been discredited. In the years following Rook's trial, the FBI had conducted a review of microscopic hair comparison testimony and found that analysts had overstated the significance of their findings in the vast majority of cases. Hair comparison could not reliably identify a specific individual. It could only determine that a hair might have come from someone with similar characteristics. North filed a motion for post-conviction DNA testing in the 17th year of Rook's imprisonment. The motion cited advances in testing technology, specifically the development of short tandem repeat analysis and touch DNA techniques that could extract genetic profiles from smaller and more degraded samples than was possible at the time of trial. The motion argued that DNA testing of the biological evidence could either definitively confirm Rook's guilt or exclude him as the source, a level of certainty that the original hair comparison could never provide. State's Attorney Slate, the current prosecutor, did not oppose the motion. Slate had joined the office 5 years earlier and had no personal investment in the original conviction. He recognized that DNA testing, if it confirmed Rook's guilt, would strengthen the case and eliminate any lingering doubt. If it excluded Rook, then the state needed to know. Judge Keystone granted the motion and ordered the Granite County evidence room to release the biological samples for testing at an independent laboratory. The testing was completed 6 months later. The laboratory report arrived at North's office on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. She read it 3 times before calling Rook at Fernwood. The DNA profile extracted from the biological evidence collected from Elena Vance's body did not match Marcus Cole. The statistical probability of a coincidental match was approximately 1 in 4. 7 trillion. In other words, there was no scientific possibility that Rook was the source of the biological material left by Elena's attacker. But the report contained a second finding that transformed the case from a simple exclusion to something far more explosive. The DNA profile had been entered into CODIS, the combined DNA index system maintained by the FBI, and had generated a hit. The profile matched a man named Dalton Mercer, a convicted sex offender who had been incarcerated for an unrelated assault committed 4 years after Elena Vance's murder. Mercer had died in prison 8 years prior, but his DNA profile remained in the database. North immediately began investigating Dalton Mercer's background. What she found was damning. Mercer had lived in Riverbend at the time of Elena's murder. In fact, he had lived less than 2 blocks from her apartment. He was approximately the same height and build as Rook. He had no alibi for the evening of March 14th. And most significantly, he had been interviewed by Detective Harbour during the initial investigation. A brief conversation, documented in a single paragraph of the case file, in which Mercer claimed to have been home watching television on the night in question. That interview was never disclosed to the defense. The prosecution's file contained no mention of Dalton Mercer as a person of interest. Either Detective Harbour had dismissed him as a suspect without documentation, or the documentation had been lost, suppressed, or overlooked. North filed an emergency motion to vacate Rook's conviction, citing newly discovered evidence of actual innocence and potential Brady violations, the failure to disclose exculpatory information to the defense. The motion demanded an evidentiary hearing to examine the DNA results and the circumstances surrounding the original investigation. The evidentiary hearing convened on a cold October morning, 17 years, 7 months, and 12 days after Marcus Cole was sentenced to life in prison. Judge Keystone presided. State's Attorney Slate represented the prosecution. Attorney North represented Rook. The first witness was Laboratory Director Quinn, who had supervised the DNA testing. Quinn explained the methodology in clear, accessible terms. The biological sample had been preserved in a sealed envelope and maintained under proper storage conditions since 1995. The sample was extracted using standard protocols, amplified using polymerase chain reaction, and analyzed using STR profiling. The resulting profile was complete and unambiguous. Quinn confirmed that the profile did not match Marcus Cole. She explained that the probability of a coincidental match, the likelihood that the true perpetrator just happened to share the same genetic markers as some other random individual, was effectively 0. She further confirmed the CODIS match to Dalton Mercer, noting that Mercer's profile had been entered into the database following his 1999 conviction for sexual assault in a neighboring county. Cross-examination by Slate was brief. He established that the biological evidence proved only that Dalton Mercer had sexual contact with Elena Vance on the night of her murder. It did not, by itself, prove that he was her killer. But the implication was clear. The prosecution's entire case had rested on the assertion that Rook was the man who sexually assaulted and murdered Elena. If Rook was not the source of the biological evidence, then the theory of the case collapsed. The second witness was Attorney North herself, who testified regarding her investigation into Dalton Mercer. She presented evidence establishing Mercer's residence in Riverbend, his criminal history, a pattern of escalating sexual violence that began with voyeurism in his teens and culminated in the 1999 assault that sent him to prison, and the single documented interview conducted by Detective Harbour. She also presented the original trial record, highlighting the limitations of the hair comparison evidence and the lack of corroboration for the alleged confession. She noted that the eyewitness identifications had been based on fleeting glimpses of a man in a dark jacket, a description that could have applied to dozens of men in the neighborhood, including Dalton Mercer. Detective Harbour was called as a witness by the defense. Now 73 years old and long retired, he testified that he had conducted the initial investigation to the best of his ability and had no recollection of suppressing any exculpatory information. When pressed about the Mercer interview, Harbour stated that he had briefly spoken with Mercer as part of routine neighborhood canvassing, but had not considered him a serious suspect because Mercer seemed cooperative and didn't match the profile. North asked Harbour to explain how Mercer didn't match the profile given that he was approximately the same height, build, and age as Rook and lived even closer to the victim's apartment. Harbour had no satisfactory answer. The final witness was Vincent Crowell, the jailhouse informant whose testimony had helped convict Rook 17 years earlier. Crowell was now 61 years old and had been released from prison 9 years prior. He testified, under immunity from perjury prosecution, that his original testimony had been fabricated. He explained that he had been facing a 20-year sentence for armed robbery when Detective Marsh approached him in the county jail and suggested that his cooperation in important cases could result in a more favorable outcome. Crowell claimed that Marsh had provided him with details about the Elena Vance murder, details that Crowell then claimed Rook had confessed to him during their conversations in the cell block. Crowell stated that he had never spoken with Rook about the murder. The entire confession was invented. Slate did not cross-examine Crowell extensively. There was little point. The DNA evidence had already demolished the foundation of the conviction. Crowell's recantation was merely the final collapse. Judge Keystone issued his ruling from the bench at 4:47 p.m. He found that the DNA evidence constituted newly discovered evidence of actual innocence, evidence that could not have been obtained through reasonable diligence at the time of trial, given the limitations of the testing technology then available. He further found that the prosecution had failed to disclose potentially exculpatory information regarding Dalton Mercer, though he stopped short of finding intentional misconduct. The conviction was vacated. The charges were dismissed without prejudice to refile, though Slate announced that the state had no intention of pursuing a retrial. Marcus Cole was ordered released immediately. The processing took 3 hours, paperwork, photographs, the return of personal effects that had been stored for 17 years, a wallet, a watch, $37 in cash. At 8:15 p.m., Rook walked through the front doors of the Granite County Courthouse for the first time as a free man. His mother was waiting on the steps. Iris Cole, now 79 years old, had driven 3 hours from her assisted living facility for the hearing. She had not been certain she would live to see this day. Neither had her son. They did not speak. There were no words adequate to the moment. They simply held each other in the cold October air, while photographers captured images that would appear in newspapers across the state the following morning. The aftermath was complicated, as it always is. The state offered Rook compensation under its wrongful conviction statute, $50,000 per year of wrongful incarceration, totaling approximately $850,000. It was not enough to restore 17 years of life, but it was something. Elena Vance's sister, Margot, issued a statement through her attorney. She expressed devastation at the revelation that her sister's true killer had never been brought to justice and had died before he could face accountability. She did not apologize to Rook. Perhaps she was not ready, perhaps she never would be. But she acknowledged that the system had failed both families. Detective Harbour was not charged with any crime. The statute of limitations had long since expired on any potential misconduct, and there was insufficient evidence to prove that he had intentionally suppressed information, rather than merely failing to recognize its significance. Vincent Crowell was not prosecuted for his perjury. His testimony had been given under immunity, and prosecutors determined that the resources required for a conviction would be better spent elsewhere. The Halcyon Innocence Project issued a detailed report analyzing the systemic failures that had led to Rook's wrongful conviction. The report identified several contributing factors. The use of unrecorded interrogations, which made it impossible to evaluate the voluntariness and accuracy of alleged confessions. The reliance on jailhouse informant testimony without adequate corroboration. The admission of microscopic hair comparison evidence despite its scientific limitations. The failure to conduct DNA testing when it was available. And the inadequate resources provided to the Public Defender's Office. The report recommended reforms. Mandatory recording of all custodial interrogations. Enhanced disclosure requirements for informant testimony and incentives, restrictions on the admission of forensic evidence that had not been validated through rigorous scientific study, expanded access to post-conviction DNA testing, and increased funding for public defense. Some of those reforms would eventually be adopted in the state. Others remained subjects of ongoing debate. 6 months after his release, Rook sat at his mother's kitchen table in the gray light of early morning. Iris had passed away 3 months prior. Peacefully, in her sleep, having seen her son freed. The house now belonged to him, the only inheritance she had to offer. On the table in front of him was a cardboard box. Inside were the letters he had written during his 17 years at Fernwood. Hundreds of them, addressed to journalists, to attorneys, to politicians, to anyone who might listen. Most had been returned, some had never been sent. All had been unanswered. He did not know what to do with them. They represented 17 years of hope and despair, of desperate pleas and bitter resignation, of a man shouting into a void that refused to hear him. He closed the box and set it aside. Outside the window, The first light of dawn crept across the rooftops of the neighborhood where he had grown up, where he had been arrested, where he had been branded a monster by a community that had never questioned the verdict. He thought about Dalton Mercer, the real killer, dead now for 8 years, never having faced justice for Elena Vance's murder. He thought about Elena herself, a woman he had never known, whose death had consumed 17 years of his life. He thought about his mother, who had believed in him when no one else would, and who had died knowing that her belief had been vindicated. He poured himself a cup of coffee and watched the sun rise. It was not redemption. It was not closure. It was simply another morning, the first of however many remained to him, in a world that had finally acknowledged what he had known all along. If this story resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone who believes that the pursuit of truth matters, even when the truth takes decades to emerge. These cases remind us that justice is not a destination, but a process, one that requires vigilance, humility, and the courage to admit when the system has failed. The evidence box sat empty in the Granite County property room, its contents finally examined, its secrets finally revealed. But in evidence rooms across the country, thousands of similar boxes waited, each one containing the potential to transform a life, to reverse a verdict, to answer the question that haunts every wrongful conviction case. What if we got it wrong? For Marcus Cole, the answer came 17 years too late. For others, it may never come at all. And for the families on both sides, those who lost loved ones to violence and those who lost loved ones to a flawed system, the search for truth continues, one case at a time, one test at a time, one hearing at a time. The courthouse in Granite County stands quiet now. The reporters have moved on to other stories. The attorneys have taken other cases. But somewhere, in another courtroom, in another state, another man sits at another table, waiting for the moment when the evidence finally speaks the truth that he has known all along.